The Outlook is the Santa Monica paper that was founded in 1875. 1875, that was even before the Los Angeles Times. It's an important paper in telling the story of a part of Los Angeles that seemed to be so far away from the center of action that people didn't even know what was going on. Santa Monica, that's where you went with a tent, isn't it, and spent the summer? But Santa Monica and the Outlook, the Evening Outlook, has been so important to telling the story of Santa Monica, and was until it closed in 1998. I decided to be a newspaper woman when I was 6 or 8 years old, after I read a child's biography of Nellie Bly, who was a woman who wrote for newspapers in the 19th century when women couldn't vote, when women couldn't own property, when they had virtually no legal standing. But she exposed political corruption in New York. She exposed the mistreatment of immigrants and of the insane. And famously, she traveled around the world in under 80 days to beat the Jules Verne record. And I thought, oh, I really want to do that. Don't Stop the Presses is a book not about so much the history of American newspapers, but the history of Americans and their relationship with the newspapers. How newspapers helped this country to become a country in the first place. How they helped the country to grow, because as the country expanded, you needed a newspaper in a town to sell real estate, to tell the stories of churches and railroads and all of the newcomers. They have been vital to telling the story and making the country happen the way it has. The great age of newspapers really started about the middle of the 19th century. We can say the Civil War, into, let's say, the Second World War and shortly afterwards, because the technology allowed more reproduction of newspapers. Americans were moving into the cities more, and so you had news and you had urban developments that were of vital importance to telling the country's story. You also had the advent of electric light, which is no small factor into looking at how newspapers could be read night and day, virtually anywhere. They could be published the same way. When you had color, when you had technology, when you had printing presses that could run off hundreds of thousands of copies, newspapers were a natural outgrowth to telling the American story. You had the press barons like Pulitzer and Hearst who were banging on each other with competition in some fashions that were not altogether pretty. But that competition gave rise to more newspapers and more ways of telling American stories, and more newspapers to do it to more Americans who were eager to hear it. The great age of newspapers ended in part because of the Second World War, where coverage became much more serious. This was literally life and death. This was life and death for the country, life and death for individual Americans, life and death for our way of life versus what we were fighting in that war. And then after the war, 1950s, but then into the 1960s, you had not just radio news, which had been around a long time, but television news, which certainly spelled the death knell for a lot of afternoon papers like the Santa Monica Evening Outlook. When people could go home and turn on a television and get news, they decided they didn't need an afternoon newspaper. And in cities like Los Angeles, where people drove to and from work, they weren't sitting in subway cars or on buses and reading newspapers. They were in their own automobiles. And unlike now where people text behind the wheel, it was a little harder to read a newspaper behind the wheel. And so all of those factors combined to generate really the death of afternoon newspapers, certainly. Newspapers in the post-Watergate era flourished because they had made a mark in Watergate. Investigative reporting came into its own. There were stricter ethics in newsrooms about how you can operate and how you cannot, which are in place to this day, thankfully. And then newspapers did not see the internet coming. They didn't see what it would be, what they could do to enhance their coverage with it, or what the competition would mean. And the first competition didn't come from news coverage. It came from advertising. It came from places like Craigslist. And so all of the classified advertising that had filled pages of newspapers was now migrating online, where it was cheaper and it was faster. And when you have a news guru like Rupert Murdoch who doesn't see it coming, who doesn't see the risk of the internet, I don't know that we can all then be blamed for not being more far-sighted about it. But rather than partnering with the internet early on and making it a part of newspaper storytelling devices, I think newspapers lag behind in embracing the internet and seeing what it could do. Now we have digital journalism, now we have the internet as part of our storytelling, but I don't think it happened early enough. The current role of newspapers is still what it has always been, which is setting the news agenda. The best subscribers to newspapers are television and radio assignment editors because they don't have the resources to have somebody at City Hall all the time, to have somebody covering the Pentagon all the time, to have somebody in the state capitol all the time. So they rely on what they read in newspapers to send out their reporters to cover stories that have been in the paper that morning. And so that's how they set the agenda, through this trickle down. People who don't even subscribe to newspapers don't know that they are getting the newspaper's news agenda when they turn on the radio news, for example, or turn on the television news, because a lot of that comes out of what the newspapers are still doing. And it's the newspapers that can spend 6 months on an investigative story, that can send people out and swarm in a way, just with a notebook and a pen, that television and radio can't necessarily do. It's not just about the numbers, it's about the time that can be spent on any particular story. Fake news is real news for which the person has no response. In the old days, if you wrote a critical story and laid out the facts that the person you were writing about did not like, that person might brush you off with a no comment. Now they say it's fake news. That's the default response. So they still have no rejoinder. They still have no comeback. They still have no counter to what it is that has been written or what has been said, but they think fake news may be enough to undercut it. And to some audiences, calling something fake news may be exactly what they want to hear and what they want to believe. Generally, when you hear the term fake news, it means you're probably right on because they've got nothing else to say. The impact of fake news rhetoric is, I think, corrosive to an important institution, an institution that the founders thought was so important that they put it in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. They understood the role that newspapers played in the origin of this country. They gave us franking privileges, cheaper postage to send newspapers and magazines to people because they believed in an informed electorate. When you have a deliberate campaign to corrode the source of news, I'm not just talking about news in Washington and New York, I'm talking about your local newspaper that does prep sports, that writes about bond issues, that covers the school board. When top to bottom you start maligning that as fake news, you begin to topple an institution that you depend on more than you actually realize. And I think this is a very dangerous game to play with a part of democracy, one of the working parts of democracy that the founders thought was vitally important to keep it going. What got me started on this book, thinking about it and writing about it, was running across this picture. This is the newsroom of the Honolulu Star-Bulletin not long after the Pearl Harbor attacks. These people have blackout windows on the curtains. They are wearing gas masks. And this is a reminder of the lengths to which journalists will go to get the story, to get the news. I have a chapter in the book about journalists who died in the line of duty. Ernie Pyle, the famous GI reporter who covered the war at the level of the man in the trenches. He is the one who was the most beloved columnist of World War II, and he died alongside the troops he served with. I know friends of mine. One was blown up in Central America, covering the conflicts there. Another had her eye injured in a bombing in Baghdad. Another friend of mine died of a heart attack covering the war in Iraq. Journalists go where the stories are, oftentimes at risk to themselves. And when we hear rhetoric like enemy of the people, obviously it hurts to hear that, and we know that it's not true. Enemy of the people is a term used by totalitarian governments in the past. But to be cast as an enemy when in fact newspapers are really in the service of readers, in the service of this country, telling this country's stories to the world and vice versa, it's very hurtful and I think very dangerous. When it comes to criticism of the news media, I think the paradox is that we are oftentimes criticized by people who don't know what we do when our job is telling other people what other people do. We need to tell our own stories better, to say, this is what goes into journalism. These are the components of getting a story. When I'm sitting in a newsroom and I'm hearing people arguing about a murder story they're covering, looking at property maps to be able to change one word to say, did it happen on X property, in X property, or near X property? All to get one preposition right. They actually pull out property maps. So people want to be correct. They want to get the story right, because we know that if we don't get it right, the competition is going to be all over us. So it's a pretty self-correcting process in many cases. And so what people need to know about the press are the stories of how we get the story. And we have not done a very good job of that. And I think we're aware of that now and wanting to do more about telling our stories, inviting people to hear how we do our stories, to see what it is that goes into this process of giving you that pound of paper on your lawn every day, those pixels that come across your computer screen and tell you the stories that you need to know and that you're looking for. A lot goes into that. Just as when you see a movie, there's so much that happens to get that movie on the screen that you don't see and don't understand. The same thing is true of a newspaper, of news agencies anywhere that tell our stories. So that's what I think we need to do more of. I wrote this book not for journalists. I wrote it for the American public, to help them understand what role newspapers have played and continue to play in their public lives, in their civic lives, even in their private lives. Whether you're doing a crossword puzzle, whether you're looking at your kids' prep sports results, whether you're deciding what local event to go to this particular week. This is a book of Americans' stories, how newspapers have failed Americans, where we have succeeded in doing a great job, and why we're positioned to keep doing that in the future. On every page, you see pictures of your fellow Americans doing this job. There are pictures, for example, of a reporter who helped to save firefighters during a terrible flood in the Pacific Northwest. There's a very moving cabinet photo from the 1890s of a staff of a newspaper in Maine where you had white people and one black woman standing there, the staff of a newspaper, a mixed-race staff. And when I got this and I looked on the back, it said, "Hide this photograph." Somebody did not want that mixed-race staff seen. This was, again, at a time when black people were still, in some parts of the country, profoundly disenfranchised, still not allowed any equal role in society. And to have one of them in a newsroom was revolutionary. I tell the story of a black reporter after the fall of Richmond in the Civil War who goes into the Richmond legislature where the Confederacy convened its leaders. He sat down in Jefferson Davis' desk, the president of the Confederacy, and wrote his newspaper story for his newspaper, a northern newspaper. And I started to cry when I read his account, because the messenger, what happens to the messenger, is just as important as the message. So you know what it is that goes into telling you these stories and why these are the stories that you're hearing. And every page in this book, to me, I go back and it's like an American album, really. This is our family. This is our country. The funny headlines, the projects that newspapers supported, like a newspaper in Texas, the Meridian Tribune, said, if you subscribe, we'll contribute money to put a telescope in a local school. How fantastic is that? Here's the Chicago Tribune that launched a war bond drive with a fake Liberty ship constructed at the front of the building. The first bikini in the world was unveiled, so to speak, in Paris. It was made out of newspaper fabric. So if the guys want to look closely and read the headlines, you say, I'm just reading it for the headlines, yes. So people used to have contests and made costumes out of newsprint and newspapers. Home ec classes did the same thing. The sports editions that people save after every World Series, after every election, people go out and buy newspapers. Here's the Santa Monica Outlook. What is that? It is the tangible, physical proof of what happened. You can't Photoshop. You can't hack 600,000 copies of a newspaper. People like feeling it in their hands. They love the stories that they tell, and they like to be able to say, look, this happened, and here's the proof of it. And so newspapers have an important role, continue to have an important role. And this book is about telling not so much newspaper reporters' stories as America's stories, as they're relayed by the newspaper, which is, after all, your family album.